Let's talk about another police investigation, not involving Nicola Sturgeon's husband, but the former President of the United States. So after he rejected 34 charges in that courthouse in New York, he delivered a very defiant speech at Mar-a-Lago, his Palm Beach home. He said he's a victim of a witch hunt and the case is fake. What do you think?
Well, I mean, joining us this morning for more is the legal fellow at Heritage Foundation and former federal prosecutor, Zack Smith. Mr. Smith, thank you very much for joining us this morning. So what do you make of what's happened? Obviously, it's a very fast-moving story again, and Mr. Trump's reaction.
Well, thank you for having me on this morning. Look, this is unprecedented. Never before in the history of the United States has a former president been indicted. And once we saw the indictment unsealed yesterday, the charges formally announced and made public, I think many people felt that this was a very thin case. Essentially, you have Alvin Bragg, who is a local district attorney, a local prosecutor there in New York City, bringing false document charges that at least in part look like they're going to depend on federal campaign finance violations. Now, what's odd about that is that in the United States, typically federal campaign finance violations are prosecuted by federal authorities. They're either prosecuted by the U.S.'s Federal Election Commission or the U.S. Department of Justice, and both of those entities decided not to pursue these charges. And so after they decided not to pursue these charges, now that you have this local district attorney, who, by the way, is of an opposite political party, he's a Democrat, than Donald Trump bringing these charges, I think many people find this entire affair very, very disturbing.
Zack, do you think it's possible that this ambitious attorney in New York, who, as you point out, is part of the Democratic Party, do you think if Joe Biden and the Democratic leadership had not wanted this to happen, they could have effectively put a stop to it?
I doubt it. In the United States, we have a two-tiered system of government. We have the national government, the federal government, and then each state has its own local government as well. And so that leads to a two-tier prosecutorial system here in the United States. You have federal prosecutors who can pursue federal charges, and then you have state and local prosecutors who can pursue state charges. And because Alvin Bragg is a local elected district attorney, a local elected prosecutor, Joe Biden, the federal government, wouldn't have really any authority to stop these charges from going forward. But I will say this, what's very interesting about this case is that by bringing these charges against Donald Trump, Alvin Bragg, who's a local official, has essentially catapulted himself into the national spotlight. I suspect he thinks this is very good for his political career. His political star is now on the rise, particularly with people on the left in United States politics. And then also, don't forget as well, Alvin Bragg, he came into office pledging not to prosecute many, many crimes, including most misdemeanors, many low-level felonies. And so now that he's bringing these charges against Donald Trump, I think many people are looking at his overall justice agenda and saying that these charges don't really fit within his broader policy priorities.
Zack, can I just ask, what happens to Trump now? What happens next in the process? I mean, I think the next trial is arranged for December, but I mean, legal experts are saying this could drag on into 2024, which is, as we know, when the next American elections are going to happen. So could you just explain exactly what happens now to Trump? I mean, he's free just to go about his business, I'm assuming.
Yeah, for now, he essentially is. Essentially, what we saw yesterday was an arraignment. It's kind of where the charges are formally announced against Donald Trump. Things like pretrial release are worked out with the court and Trump's attorneys. And so I suspect what we're going to see now is a flurry of pretrial motions by his lawyers. We'll likely see motions by his lawyers to get the charges dismissed. I suspect you'll see motions to get the case transferred somewhere else within the state of New York. Right now, how the case is going to move forward in Lower Manhattan in New York City. Donald Trump and his lawyers, I suspect, will argue that it's impossible for him to get a fair trial in Manhattan. And so they'll ask the judge to transfer it somewhere else within the state. But I suspect the trial date will likely be moved. I suspect we're going to see a lot of pretrial motions by both the prosecutors and by Trump's defense attorneys. And I think in many ways, we are just getting started with these charges against Donald Trump, because don't forget, he's also facing a federal investigation by a special counsel with the U.S. Department of Justice. And then there's also an investigation being run out of the state of Georgia by a different local elected district attorney there as well.
Can I ask you just finally, Zach, until a few weeks ago, Ron DeSantis seemed to be a shoo-in for the Republican Party nomination to be the next president. He's almost been buried by Donald Trump, and he's now, 24 points behind. Can he come back, or are we now looking at a procession for Donald Trump to be the next Republican Party candidate?
Well, I think my crystal ball is broken, so I've given up trying to predict politics. I try to stick to the policy these days. But look, I think this is certainly going to dominate the headlines as we head into the 2024 election season. These charges against Donald Trump, it's something that nearly every other major political candidate, including Ron DeSantis, has already weighed in on. And so I suspect we'll hear about this a lot as the presidential campaign kicks into high gear.
All right, that's Zach Smith from the Washington-based Heritage Foundation.
It's absolutely fascinating, isn't
Really
it? I must
is.
admit. And I love the fact that if he, does become president, he could pardon himself even if he's in prison.
Incredible.
Go figure.